Machiavelli reveals that people do not always repay help with loyalty. Kindness is often seen as virtue. Helping feels human. Giving feels moral. Support feels like strength. But Machiavelli understood that in the world of power, generosity is not always received as gratitude. Sometimes it is received as an opportunity. Machiavelli reveals that people do not always repay help with loyalty. They often repay it with dependence, entitlement, or betrayal. This is not a call to become cold. It is a call to see clearly. Because there are moments when helping becomes weakness, not because compassion is wrong, but because human nature is unstable. It is one of the earliest instincts of being human, to believe that kindness will be returned with loyalty. For many, giving is tied to identity. To be helpful is to be good. But Machiavelli begins with a different realism. He does not deny virtue. He simply warns that virtue does not always protect, because people do not respond only to goodness. They respond to perception, advantage, and circumstance. A prince who gives too much may appear merciful, but he may also appear weak, and weakness invites testing. Machiavelli writes that human beings are often ungrateful, fickle, driven by self-interest. They remain loyal while it benefits them, and change when it does not. This is not bitterness. It is an observation. The emotional weight of giving is that it carries expectation. The giver hopes for gratitude. The helper hopes for loyalty. But Machiavelli teaches that gratitude is unstable. People forget favors quickly. They remember injuries longer. So generosity, if unmanaged, becomes vulnerability. Not because helping is wrong, but because human nature is inconsistent. A prince who relies on being loved through generosity becomes dependent on affection. And affection, Machiavelli warns, is fragile. The world admires gifts, but it does not always repay them with respect. Sometimes repeated giving creates entitlement. Support becomes assumed. Kindness becomes an obligation, and the giver becomes trapped inside their own virtue. This is where helping begins to feel heavy, not because compassion disappears, but because it is not mirrored. Machiavelli's insight is not that one should never help. It is that generosity must be understood psychologically. To give without discernment is to give away leverage. And the first step is recognition. In the world Machiavelli describes, kindness is powerful, but only when it is not allowed to become weak. One of Machiavelli's most unsettling truths is simple. Loyalty is conditional. He observes that people remain devoted while life is stable, but abandon quickly when stability breaks. This is not cruelty. It is human psychology under pressure. Gratitude is often temporary. A favor may be felt deeply in the moment, but over time, the mind adjusts. What once seemed generous becomes normal. Support becomes expected. And expectation replaces appreciation. Machiavelli writes that men are ungrateful, fickle, deceptive, not because they are evil, but because self-preservation guides them. When danger appears, people protect themselves first. When advantage shifts, loyalty shifts with it. This is why Machiavelli warns princes not to build their security on affection alone. Help does not guarantee devotion. Kindness does not guarantee honor, because loyalty is not a fixed trait. It is often a response to circumstance. A person may praise you when they need you, but once they no longer do, the bond weakens. This is the psychological instability of dependence. Those who receive help may feel close, but they may also feel indebted. And indebtedness can become resentment. Machiavelli understood that people do not always love those who assist them. Sometimes they fear them. Sometimes they envy them. Sometimes they quietly wish to escape the imbalance. So helping can create complicated emotions, not pure gratitude, but tension. This is why generosity must be measured. A prince who gives endlessly may be liked, but not respected, and respect is more stable than affection. Machiavelli famously writes that love is held by obligation, and obligation breaks when self-interest calls. So the lesson is not that loyalty is impossible, it is that loyalty is not guaranteed by kindness alone. To help without understanding human nature is to expect repayment from a world that does not always repay. And this is where Machiavelli's realism begins. The wise do not stop being compassionate. They stop being naive about what compassion secures. Machiavelli understood that dependence is one of the most dangerous psychological patterns in power. Because the more someone relies on you, the more unstable the relationship becomes. At first, support feels appreciated. The receiver feels grateful. The giver feels valued. But over time, the mind adapts. What was once a gift becomes an expectation. The help is no longer seen as kindness. It becomes assumed. An assumption quietly turns into entitlement. Machiavelli warns that people often desire what benefits them, but they do not always respect what they receive easily. When assistance arrives repeatedly, effort disappears. Responsibility weakens. The receiver stops growing, and the giver becomes trapped. This is why Machiavelli argues that a prince must avoid generosity that creates weakness in the state. Because resources are limited, and dependence spreads. If a ruler gives too freely, the people become needy. If a leader rescues too often, others stop standing. Psychologically, dependence removes self-reliance. The nervous system learns to seek external saving rather than internal strength. And this becomes dangerous, because when the giver finally stops, the dependent person does not always feel gratitude. They feel betrayal. What was once help became an obligation. This is the dark shift Machiavelli exposes. The more you give without boundaries, the more others feel entitled to what is not theirs. And entitlement becomes resentment when interrupted. So kindness, without discernment, creates emotional instability, not only in others, but in the giver, because giving becomes fear. If I stop, will I be hated? If I withdraw, will I lose love? Machiavelli teaches that power is lost when generosity becomes dependency. The wise do not stop helping. They stop enabling. Because true strength is not endless giving. It is measured support that preserves dignity, help that does not create weakness. And this is where discernment begins. Not all assistance creates loyalty. Sometimes it creates chains. The hardest part of Machiavelli's realism is not understanding others. It is understanding the self. Because compassion is not only an action, it is identity. Many people help because they fear what they become if they do not. They associate restraint with coldness, boundaries with cruelty. So even when kindness is exploited, the mind hesitates. It feels guilty. It asks, am I becoming selfish? Machiavelli understood that rulers often face this internal conflict. To lead is to choose necessity over comfort, to act strategically even when emotion urges softness. This is not because the prince must lose humanity, but because the world does not always reward it. The compassionate mind wants to believe help will be returned with loyalty. But Machiavelli reminds us that human beings are unstable. They change with circumstance. So compassion becomes complicated, because giving feels good, but being used feels humiliating. The helper begins to feel torn. One part wants to continue. Another part feels drained. This is the internal battle. The desire to be kind, and the need to protect. Machiavelli teaches that power is not cruelty, but clarity. The prince must learn that refusal is sometimes wisdom, that restraint is sometimes mercy, because endless giving does not always save others. It often weakens both sides. The guilt comes from misunderstanding strength. Strength is not constant sacrifice, it is discernment. The ability to recognize when compassion becomes permission for exploitation. This chapter is the emotional struggle of boundaries. Saying no feels like a loss, but Machiavelli suggests it is preservation. Not preservation of ego, but preservation of structure. Because without structure, generosity collapses into resentment, and resentment becomes bitterness. So the compassionate person must learn something difficult. Helping is not always virtuous if it destroys the helper. Kindness is not weakness, but unchecked kindness becomes vulnerability. And vulnerability, in Machiavelli's world, is always tested. The hardest part of Machiavelli's realism is not understanding others. It is understanding the self. Because compassion is not only an action, it is identity. Many people help because they fear what they become if they do not. They associate restraint with coldness, boundaries with cruelty. So even when kindness is exploited, the mind hesitates. It feels guilty. It asks, am I becoming selfish? Machiavelli understood that rulers often face this internal conflict. To lead is to choose necessity over comfort, to act strategically even when emotion urges softness. This is not because the prince must lose humanity, but because the world does not always reward it. The compassionate mind wants to believe help will be returned with loyalty. But Machiavelli reminds us that human beings are unstable. They change with circumstance. So compassion becomes complicated, because giving feels good, but being used feels humiliating. The helper begins to feel torn. One part wants to continue. Another part feels drained. This is the internal battle, the desire to be kind, and the need to protect. Machiavelli teaches that power is not cruelty, but clarity. The prince must learn that refusal is sometimes wisdom, that restraint is sometimes mercy, because endless giving does not always save others. It often weakens both sides. The guilt comes from misunderstanding strength. Strength is not constant sacrifice, it is discernment, the ability to recognize when compassion becomes permission for exploitation. This chapter is the emotional struggle of boundaries. Saying no feels like a loss, but Machiavelli suggests it is preservation. Not preservation of ego, but preservation of structure. Because without structure, generosity collapses into resentment, and resentment becomes bitterness. So the compassionate person must learn something difficult. Helping is not always virtuous if it destroys the helper. Kindness is not weakness, but unchecked kindness becomes vulnerability. And vulnerability, in Machiavelli's world, is always tested. Machiavelli does not teach the abandonment of compassion. He teaches the discipline of it. Because the question is not whether to help. The question is how to help without losing structure. In The Prince, power is not maintained through endless giving, but through stability. A leader must preserve resources. A person must preserve energy. Help that destroys the helper becomes weakness. So integration begins with boundaries. Helping becomes intentional, not reflexive. Support becomes measured, not unlimited. This is where strength matures. The wise person learns that generosity is most powerful when it does not create dependence. True help restores autonomy. It does not replace it. Machiavelli understood that people respect what is stable. They respect what is not easily taken. So kindness must exist alongside firmness. A prince may offer mercy, but not at the cost of authority. A person may offer support, but not at the cost of self-erasure. This chapter is about discernment, knowing who is truly in need and who is merely consuming, knowing when help builds strength and when it builds entitlement. Psychologically, this is emotional intelligence. The nervous system no longer reacts from guilt. It responds from clarity. The helper no longer gives to avoid rejection. They give because it is chosen, and choice is power. Machiavelli's lesson is that respect survives where structure survives. Kindness without structure collapses. Structure without kindness becomes cold. So the balance is quiet. Compassion with limits. Generosity with awareness. Support without surrender. This is not becoming harsh. It is becoming grounded. Helping without losing power means helping without losing the self. And when the self is preserved, help becomes stronger. Because it is no longer desperate, it is deliberate, and deliberation is the deepest form of strength in Machiavelli's world. In the end, Machiavelli's lesson is not that kindness is wrong. It is that kindness must be wise, because the world does not always receive generosity as love. Sometimes it receives it as access. Sometimes it receives it as weakness. And The Prince is ultimately a book about survival through clarity. Discernment is the quiet form of strength that replaces naivety. It is the ability to help without being consumed, to give without being emptied, to care without surrendering control. Machiavelli understood that people remember what benefits them, but they also test what they believe they can take. So the wise do not abandon compassion. They protect it. They reserve it for what is real, for what is honest, for what does not grow entitled. This is not bitterness. It is maturity. The person who learns discernment stops rescuing as a way to be loved. They stop helping as a way to feel safe. They stop giving as a form of self-erasure. Instead, they become steady. Their kindness becomes chosen. Their boundaries become quiet. Their presence becomes strong. Machiavelli's darkest truth is that power is lost through uncontrolled softness. But his deeper truth is that power can coexist with mercy. When mercy is disciplined, helping becomes strength when it does not create dependence. Generosity becomes respect when it is not automatic. And compassion becomes sustainable when it is protected by clarity. In this quiet closure, the mind understands. Not everyone who asks deserves access. Not every need is honest. Not every act of giving is virtue. Sometimes the strongest kindness is restraint. And sometimes the wisest help is knowing when not to help. That is Machiavelli's realism. Not cruelty, discernment, the quiet wisdom of seeing clearly and remaining whole.